Hello and welcome to the Baseball Aesthetic Podcast. We are just 1 week away from our first spring training games of the season. I'm looking at some snow. It's melted a little bit, but it's been a cold winter if you live in the Midwest like I do, or obviously Northeast or anywhere in there. But it is always a sign that spring is right around the corner once we see those players reporting to camp. And now we're just 1 week away from official spring training games, which I am so excited for. And then we also have the World Baseball Classic coming up starting in March, which is going to be so fun to watch. So it is a great time for getting ready for baseball. It's on its way. It'll be here before too long. Now the countdown really is on to official opening day at the end of March. But with that being said, I wanted to take a look back and see the 2025 regular season stats and look back on those stats to see if these stories that they can tell make sense, because sometimes stats and numbers make sense and sometimes they don't make any sense at all. Sometimes they tell a story and sometimes they are just like completely outliers with certain stats or numbers. But I wanted to go back and take a look at some of the regular season offensive and defensive stats in the 2025 season just to see if they tell the story of what happened, and just to give some also little interesting insights about some of the data and how it relates to how the season went. So we're still a little bit away from, games getting officially started and really ramping up. So what better way to help us get ready for baseball season by taking a look at some previous stats from last season. So starting with the offensive stats, there were a total of 163,664 total regular season at-bats last year across all 30 teams. The team that had the fewest number of at-bats were the Cleveland Guardians, who came up to bat 5,310 times. And the team that had the most number of at-bats were the Boston Red Sox, who had 5,562 total at-bats. So really, at-bats between the fewest number and the most number of teams really similar. So not a big difference in there, which makes sense. So I'll reference that 163,664 number of at-bats with some of our other offensive categories. But looking at those total number of at-bats, there were 40,138 total hits out of those total at-bats. That brought the average across all 30 teams to 245. The team average total number of hits was 1,338, and the team that had the fewest number of hits were the Cleveland Guardians, again, at 1,199 total hits. And not a big surprise here, the Toronto Blue Jays were the team that had the most number of hits at 1,461. So looking at the batting average with that, the Los Angeles Angels had the lowest batting average last season at 225. They had 1,209 total hits out of their 5,374 total at-bats. The team that had the highest average was, once again, the team that had the most number of hits, so that makes sense, were the Toronto Blue Jays, who batted 265, and that was 1,461 total hits out of their 5,507 total at-bats. The player that had the most number of at-bats last season was Julio Rodriguez from the Seattle Mariners, who had 652 total at-bats, and the player that had the most number of hits last season was Bobby Witt from the Kansas City Royals with 184 total hits. So we had 40,138 total hits, and out of those total hits, there were 7,745 total doubles. The MLB average for doubles was 258 across all 30 teams. The team with the fewest number of doubles were the Los Angeles Angels with 212. And the team with the most number of doubles were the Boston Red Sox with 324. So a pretty big difference there, about 112 difference between the team with the fewest number of doubles and the team with the most number of doubles. So looking at those 7,745 total doubles, that means 19.3% of all hits last regular season were for a double. The team that had the worst percentage of, or the lowest percentage of their hits being for a double were the Seattle Mariners, who had a 17.4%. So they had 234 total doubles out of their 1,345 total hits. The team that had the highest percentage of hits being a double were the Boston Red Sox, who were at 22.9%, so 23%, and that was 324 total doubles out of their 1,414 total hits. And once again, Bobby Witt is going to be the leader in this category. This time it is for the most number of doubles across baseball last season. So now looking at triples, this is where that number significantly drops off. So again, we had 40,138 total hits. And out of that total hits, only 628 of those were for a triple. MLB average was at 21 across all 30 teams. The teams that had the fewest number of triples last season were the Seattle Mariners and the St. Louis Cardinals, who accounted for 9 triples. And the team that had the most number of triples was the Arizona Diamondbacks, who hit 38 of those triples. So once again, a pretty big gap there between the team with the fewest and the most number of triples. But since it is such a low number of triples compared to the number of hits, that 628 total triples out of that 40,138 total hits means that 1.6% of all hits last season were for a triple. The team that had the lowest percentage of their hits being a triple was the Seattle Mariners, who had a 0.67% of all hits being a triple, 9 triples out of their 1,345 total hits. And oddly enough, the team that had the highest percentage of their hits being a triple were the Colorado Rockies, who went 2.89% of all of their hits being for a triple, which was 37 triples out of their 1,281 total hits. So the Colorado Rockies didn't have a great season last year, but they were the team that had the highest percentage of their hits ending in a triple. The player that had the most number of triples was Corbin Carroll, who had 17 triples, and he alone had more triples than a lot of other teams had combined in total for the season. So let's look at home runs. There were 5,650 total home runs last season. The team with the fewest number of home runs were the Pittsburgh Pirates, who hit 117. And the team with the most number of home runs were the New York Yankees, who hit 274 total home runs. So 14.1% of all hits ended in a home run. The team with the fewest number, or the worst percentage of their hits being a home run, were the Pittsburgh Pirates. Obviously, they were the team that had the fewest number of home runs, so this is going to make sense. But they were only at a 9.4% of all hits ending in a home run, 117 home runs out of their 1,244 total hits. And the team that had the best percentage of their hits being a home run were the New York Yankees, who were at 20%, 274 total home runs out of their 1,371 total hits. So a fifth of the time that there was a hit by the Yankees, it was for a home run. So 20% for the New York Yankees, well above average there. Definitely getting back to their nickname of the Bronx Bombers, but New York Yankees, lots of home runs last year. Looking at RBIs, there were 20,740 total RBIs with an average of 692 across all teams. The team with the fewest number of RBIs were the Pittsburgh Pirates at 561, and the New York Yankees at 820 as the most number of RBIs across all teams. Shohei Ohtani did have the most number of runs scored at 146 total runs scored, and Kyle Schwarber from the Philadelphia Phillies was the player that had the most number of RBIs at 132. So Shohei Ohtani scored the most number of runs, and Kyle Schwarber from the Phillies was the one that drove in the most number of runs. Looking at walks, there were 15,379 total walks last season, with a 513 average across all 30 teams. The team that drew the fewest number of walks were the Colorado Rockies at 395, and the team with the most number of walks were the New York Yankees at 639. So 9.4% of all of those 163,664 total at-bats ended in a walk. The team with the lowest percentage of their at-bats ending in a walk were the Rockies at 7.3%, 395 walks out of their 5,408 total at-bats. And the New York Yankees had the highest percentage of walks ending in an at-bat at 11.7%, 639 total walks out of their 5,471 total at-bats. And Juan Soto was the player that drew the most walks last season at 127. Looking at strikeouts, there were 40,645 total strikeouts, with an average across all teams at 1,355. The Kansas City Royals had the fewest number of strikeouts, which in this case is a good sign. So they had 1,096 total strikeouts, and the Los Angeles Angels were the team with the most number of strikeouts at 1,627 strikeouts. 24.2% of all at-bats ended in a strikeout. The worst percentage of strikeouts or at-bats ending in a strikeout was the Los Angeles Angels at 30.3% of all at-bats ending in a strikeout. And the Toronto Blue Jays had the best percentage, which was 20% of all their at-bats ending in a strikeout. James Wood, unfortunately, was the leader in the most number of strikeouts last season at 221. So now let's take a look at hits over strikeouts. So looking at how many hits versus strikeouts. The average across all 30 teams was minus 17, meaning there were 17 more strikeouts than there were hits. The team that had the lowest number, which in this case isn't a good stat, was the Los Angeles Angels, who were at minus 418, meaning they had 1,627 total strikeouts and only 1,209 total hits. So they were minus 418 more strikeouts than hits. And they were the only team in that negative 400 range. The next closest team were the Colorado Rockies, who were minus 250. So that's 168 total difference of the last place team to the 29th ranked team, which was the Rockies. So definitely significant number of more strikeouts than hits last season for the Angels. The team that had the best number of hits versus strikeouts were the Toronto Blue Jays, who were plus 362. So they had 1,461 total hits and only 1,099 total strikeouts. So 362 more hits than they had strikeouts. And they were the only team in that positive 300 range, which makes sense why that led them to the postseason and ultimately the World Series, as they were a team that did not strike out as much as they hit. So obviously, simple to say, if you hit more than you strike out, you're going to have success. So looking at stolen bases, there were 3,440 total stolen bases last season out of 4,429 total opportunities. There were 989 total caught stealing. So the success rate for all stolen bases last season was 75.5%. The MLB average across all 30 teams was 115 stolen bases with 33 caught steals and 148 total opportunities. The team that had the fewest number of stolen bases were the Detroit Tigers, who only had 61 total stolen bases. They were caught stealing 16 times, so they were 61 out of 77 for their total opportunities. The only two teams had opportunities below 100 were the San Francisco Giants at 92 total opportunities and the Tigers at 77 total opportunities. The team that had the most number of stolen bases were the Tampa Bay Rays at 194 total stolen bases and only 48 caught steals, which had a 242 total opportunities. So they were successful 194 out of their 242 opportunities. There were 11 teams who had less than 100 total steals. The Tigers, the Giants, the Blue Jays, the Athletics, the Braves, the White Sox, the Astros, the Rockies, the Angels, the Dodgers, and the Cardinals. The percentage of successful stolen bases, looking at the team with the worst number, or the lowest percentage of successful stolen bases, were the Colorado Rockies, who were at 69%, which was 87 stolen bases, and their caught stealing were 39. So out of their 126 total opportunities, they were successful on 87 of those. And the team that had the highest percentage of successful stolen bases out of their opportunities were the New York Mets, who were at 89.1%, 147 total stolen bases out of their 165 total opportunities. So they were only caught stealing 18 times. 147 stolen bases, caught stealing 18 times. That's a pretty good success rate. And that was 7% higher than the next closest team, which was the Chicago Cubs. So the Mets, very successful last season in their stolen bases. The player with the most number of stolen bases was Jose Caballero from the New York Yankees at 49. And the player that had the best percentage of stolen bases was Byron Buxton. He went 24-0, 24 stolen bases, and 0 times he was caught stealing. The next closest was Trevor Story, who actually had more stolen bases. He had 31 total stolen bases, but he was caught stealing 1 time. So Byron Buxton obviously was 100% in a successful rate, but Trevor Story, 31 stolen bases and 1 caught stealing, very impressive as well. Like I mentioned before, average across all 30 teams was at 245, and the team with the lowest average were the Angels at 225, and the team with the highest percentage was the Blue Jays at 265, and Aaron Judge was the player with the highest batting average last season at 331. So taking a look at the offensive stats from the World Series, so we obviously all know what happened in the World Series. It was a great World Series, very entertaining, came down to some very close plays in there. But in the 7 games of the World Series, there were 540 total at-bats. There were 60 runs scored, 34 runs scored by the Blue Jays, and 26 runs scored by the Dodgers. There were 128 total hits, 75 of those from the Blue Jays, 53 of those from the Dodgers. 19 doubles, 10 of those from the Blue Jays, 9 of those from the Dodgers. 1 triple, which was from the Blue Jays. 19 home runs, 8 of those from the Blue Jays, 11 of those from the Dodgers. 58 total RBIs, 33 from the Blue Jays, 25 from the Dodgers. 61 walks, 28 of those from the Blue Jays, 33 from the Dodgers, and 136 total strikeouts, 64 of those from the Blue Jays, 72 from the Dodgers. There were 3 stolen bases, 2 from Toronto and 1 from LA, and there were 3 total caught steals, 2 from Toronto and 1 from LA. So all in all, we had a 50% success rate from stolen bases in the World Series. Toronto went 2 for 2, and LA went 1-for-1. The average across those 7 games, Toronto was at 269, and the LA Dodgers were at 203. So the Blue Jays were 75 hits out of their 279 total at-bats. And then the Dodgers were 53 hits out of their 261 total at-bats. So interesting stat here for the World Series. Toronto had 12 more runs than the Dodgers. They had 22 more hits than the Dodgers. They had one more double. They had one more triple. And they had 8 more RBIs. But the Dodgers had 3 more home runs, 5 more walks, and Toronto had 8 less strikeouts. Toronto also had that 0.66 higher batting average. So Toronto definitely led in some of the more offensive stats in the World Series, which makes sense why the World Series was so close and why the Dodgers ultimately were so close to winning the World Series. But, some of these stats kind of tell that story, but some of the story of, having more hits and more home runs in certain areas when it wasn't needed, the Dodgers came through when it was needed with their stats and ultimately winning the World Series last year. But interesting stats looking at the World Series and how Toronto had the upper hand. If you're looking at the stats on paper, had the upper hand where you would think, okay, if you didn't watch any of the games, you would think, okay, Toronto is probably going to win the World Series if you weren't watching it, just looking at stats. But as we know, stats and things on paper don't go for actually what's happening in the real world game. So, again, congrats to the Dodgers on that great World Series. We'll see. They're looking probably for that three-peat, I'm sure. So they're going to be the team to beat. Looking at defensive and pitching categories now. So the ERA across all 30 teams last season was at 4.15. The team with the best ERA were the Rangers at 3.47. The team with the worst ERA were the Colorado Rockies at 5.97. There were 29 total complete games last season. So out of the 4,860 total games played, only 29 complete games, meaning 0.60% of all games last season ended in a complete game. The team with the most number of complete games were the Cincinnati Reds at 4 total complete games, and the teams with the least number of complete games was 13 of them. So the Brewers, the Royals, the Cubs, the Mariners, the Yankees, the Dodgers, the White Sox, the Diamondbacks, the Marlins, the Athletics, the Angels, the Nationals, and the Rockies all had 0 complete games from their pitching staff. So now looking at shutouts, there were 331 total shutouts last season out of those 4,860 total games. So that means 6.8% of all of those games ended in a shutout. Across all 30 teams, the average was 11. The team that had the most number of shutouts, a little bit surprising here, were the Pittsburgh Pirates at 19 total shutouts. The team with the least number of shutouts were the Colorado Rockies with 3 total shutouts. But definitely surprising there. I mean, when you got Paul Skeens, every 5th day going, you're going to have an opportunity to have shutout games. But 19 total shutouts from the Pittsburgh Pirates last season. Pretty impressive for the Pittsburgh Pirates. But interesting that they had the season they had, but led with 19 total shutouts. Looking at saves, there were 1,201 total saves last season. So out of that 4,860 total games, 24.7% of all of those games ended with a pitcher getting credit for a save. Across all 30 teams, there was an average of 40 saves across all 30. The team that had the most number of saves were the San Diego Padres at 49, and the Chicago White Sox only had 25 saves last season, which was the lowest across baseball. So looking at hit differential here, the Milwaukee Brewers had the best ratio of hit differential, which was the number of hits given up versus the number of hits that they had offensively. So the Milwaukee So looking at hit differential, this is looking at looking at hit differential, looking at the number of hits that a team gave up defensively versus how many number of hits they hit offensively, the Milwaukee Brewers had the best ratio at plus 186. So they had 1,423 total hits offensively, and they gave up 1,237 total hits on the defensive side. So plus 186 more hits offensively versus defensively given up. The team that had the lowest ratio in that were the Colorado Rockies, who were at a minus 392, meaning they had 1,281 total hits offensively, but they gave up 1,673 total hits. So minus 392 total hits given up versus the number of hits they had offensively. There were 18 teams who had a minus differential and 12 teams that had a positive differential. Atlanta was the closest team to null, closest team to zero there. They were -1 in their hit differential. So they had 1,349 total hits for, and they had 1,348 total hits against. So almost a complete wash for the Braves last season. And then looking at blown saves. So there were 709 total blown saves last season. The team that had the most number of blown saves were the Los Angeles Angels at 34, and the team with the least number of blown saves were the San Diego Padres at 16. So looking at runs given up and looking at the differential of runs given up versus runs scored, the team that gave up the least number of runs last season were the Texas Rangers, who gave up 605 total runs, and the Colorado Rockies gave up the most number of runs last season at 1,021, which was 122 more than the next closest team, which was the Washington Nationals. So they gave up 899 total runs, and then a big gap between the Nationals and the Rockies, who gave up 1,021 total runs. Now looking at run differential, so obviously the number of runs given up versus the number of runs scored offensively, and the Milwaukee Brewers were the leader in this with a plus 172, meaning they scored 172 more runs than they gave up. They had 634 total runs against, and then they had 806 total runs for offensively. So that's that plus 172 number. And the team with the worst number of run differential were the Colorado Rockies, who were at a minus 424. So they had 1,021 total runs that they gave up, but only scored 597 total runs. So that's that minus 424 total run differential. So looking at teams that were closest to that zero mark, the same number of runs given up as the same number of runs that they had offensively, the Arizona Diamondbacks were +6, so they gave up 785 total runs, and they scored 791 total runs, and the Cleveland Guardians, who were a -6, so they gave up 649 total runs, and they scored 643 total runs. Looking at total home runs given up here. So the San Francisco Giants were the team that gave up the least number of home runs on the defensive side at 143 total home runs. Obviously, they play in a very pitcher-friendly ballpark, so that helped out a little bit. But either way, they're the team that gave up the least number of home runs, and the team that gave up the most number of home runs were the Colorado Rockies, who gave up 251 total runs. Looking at the best home run differential, the Yankees were +99 in their home run differential, so they gave up 175 total home runs, but they hit 274 total runs. So definitely good stat there for the Bronx Bombers, being +99 in that home run differential. And the team that had the worst home run differential were the Colorado Rockies, who were minus 91. So they gave up 251 total home runs, and they only hit 160 home runs on the offensive side. The best percentage of home runs given up, or hits being a home run given up, were the So the best percentage of their hits being for a home run were the San Francisco Giants, who were at 10.6%. So meaning they gave up 1,353 total hits, but out of that total hits, 143 of those were for a home run. And the team that had the highest percentage of defensively giving up a hit, but it being for a home run, were the Tampa Bay Rays, who were at 16.1%. So they had 1,273 total hits given up, and out of that number, 205 of those were for a home run. The Cleveland Guardians were the team that was closest to zero, where they were -1. So they gave up 169 total home runs, and offensively, they hit 168 total home runs. So almost a wash there for the Cleveland Guardians. And then lastly, let's look at hit by pitches. So there were 1,928 total hit by pitch last year. 64 was the average across all teams. The teams that hit the most number of batters were the Washington Nationals, who hit 89 opposing batters, and the team that hit the least number of opposing batters were the Kansas City Royals, who only hit 45. So let's look at hit by pitch differential. The Athletics were at a -36, so meaning their pitchers hit opposing batters 80 times, but offensively, they were only hit by a pitch 44 times. The St. Louis Cardinals were the other spectrum of that, where they had a +40. So their pitchers hit opposing batters 48 times, and offensively, the Cardinals were hit by a pitch 88 times. So the Cardinals had 40 more hit by pitches offensively than defensively, and for their pitchers that they gave that free base away. Boston was almost at zero. They had a 1 differential, so they offensively they were hit by a pitch 72 times, and their pitchers hit opposing batters 73 total times. Looking at walks given up, the Los Angeles Angels gave up 620 total walks, and the Chicago Cubs gave up the fewest number of walks at 405. Looking at walk differential, the best team was the Chicago Cubs, who were at a +149. So meaning they gave up 405 total walks on the defensive side, but they drew 554 total walks offensively. The team with the worst differential were the Colorado Rockies, who were at a -159. So they gave up 554 total walks, and they only drew 395 total walks offensively. And the Toronto Blue Jays were almost at a zero with their differential, so they gave up 517 total walks, and they drew 520 total walks, so they were +3 on their walk differential. Lastly, let's look at strikeouts. So the team that had the most number of strikeouts from their pitching staff were the Los Angeles Dodgers, who had 1,505 total strikeouts, and the Colorado Rockies had the fewest number of strikeouts from their pitching staff at 1,093. Strikeout differential, so number of strikeouts defensively versus the number of strikeouts offensively. The team that had the best there was the Toronto Blue Jays, who were +331. They had 1,430 total strikeouts that their pitching staff gave opposing batters, and they only had 1,099 strikeouts on the offensive side, and the Rockies had the worst ratio there at -438. So they had 1,093 total strikeouts from their pitching staff, but offensively they struck out 1,531 total times. And the Minnesota Twins were the only team with a differential of strikeouts from offensively to defensively at 0. So offensively, they had 1,372 total strikeouts, and defensively, they had 1,372 total strikeouts. So lots of numbers, lots of stats in there. It's fun to look back at this and then see those percentages and see kind of the stories they tell. And again, stats sometimes tell stories and sometimes they are just completely random. But either way, it's fun to dive into those stats and look at it and kind of, just have baseball on your mind, getting into spring training and pitchers and catchers reporting. So before too long, we're going to be hearing the crack of the bat, hearing the ball hitting the mitt, and we're going to have some spring training and World Baseball Classic, which is going to be awesome. So 1 week away from the official spring training games getting underway. Hope you're as excited as I am, but that is all for now, so we will catch you next time.